My husband, Walter, asked me to promise him one thing before he died. Whatever happens, never sell the old barn. At the time I smiled. I thought he was talking about memories. That barn had stood behind our farmhouse for almost 70 years. Its paint had faded decades ago. The roof leaked every spring. The doors barely closed anymore. To everyone else, it was just another collapsing building waiting to be torn down. Even our son called it, that useless pile of wood. Walter never explained why it mattered. Whenever I asked, he would simply smile, place his rough hand over mine and say, "One day you'll understand." After he passed away, I couldn't even look at the barn. Every nail, every board, every creak in the old wood reminded me of him. For 15 years I kept my promise. Developers offered money. Neighbors wanted the land. My own family insisted I sell it. They said I was holding on to the past. Maybe they were right. I was 78 years old. Maintaining the property had become harder every year. Then one rainy afternoon, everything changed. Because while cleaning inside that forgotten barn, my foot broke through one loose wooden plank, and beneath the floor, I found something Walter had hidden from everyone. Something that completely changed everything I thought I knew about my husband, and about our family. The morning my foot went through the barn floor didn't begin any differently from the hundreds before it. Rain had been falling since before sunrise, tapping softly against my bedroom window, the same peaceful sound Walter used to call the heartbeat of the farm. Even after 15 years without him, I still found myself listening for his footsteps before getting out of bed. Old habits never truly disappear. They simply become quieter. I made coffee in the same chipped enamel pot we'd owned for decades, carried my mug onto the porch, and stared across the wet pasture. Beyond the tall grass stood the old barn, leaning slightly to one side, weathered by nearly 70 years of snow, storms, scorching summers and bitter winters. Its faded red paint had long surrendered to gray wood, and one of the upper windows hung crooked from a rusted hinge. Most people would have seen nothing but a building waiting to collapse. I saw the last place where Walter still seemed to exist. Ever since his funeral, I had honored the promise I'd made beside his hospital bed. Never sell the old barn. He never explained why. Not once. Whenever I asked, even during the difficult months when his illness had grown worse, he simply smiled with that calm expression that had always made me trust him more than anyone else in this world. "One day you'll understand." Those were among the last complete words he ever spoke to me. For years, I convinced myself that the barn mattered only because of the memories it held. That was where we had stored our first tractor after saving for nearly 8 years. It was where our children built rope swings from the rafters. Where our grandchildren chased kittens through piles of hay every summer. Walter had repaired fences there, sharpened tools there, and escaped there whenever he wanted silence after family arguments. Felt sacred. Not because of the wood. Because of the life we had built around it. Still, time never asks permission. The roof had started leaking badly the previous winter, and every heavy rain left puddles inside. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. If the floor continued rotting, the entire structure might become dangerous. That morning, I grabbed an old broom, a bucket, and a small toolbox before slowly walking across the muddy yard. The air smelled of wet earth and pine trees, exactly as it had the autumn Walter proposed to me more than 50 years earlier. As I pushed the heavy wooden doors open, they groaned loudly enough to startle a pair of birds nesting in the rafters. Dust floated through narrow beams of gray light that slipped between the weathered boards. The familiar scent of old timber, machine oil, hay, and damp earth wrapped around me like an old blanket. Everything inside remained almost exactly where Walter had left it. His workbench, his rusted lantern, an old pair of leather gloves hanging from a nail. Even a cracked coffee mug still rested beside a box of rusty nails, as though he had stepped outside for a moment and might return before lunchtime. I smiled without realizing it. Then I quietly whispered the words I still found myself saying whenever I entered that building. "I'm just borrowing your barn for a little while, Walter." Had no idea that before the morning was over, I would discover that my husband had never been protecting the barn at all. I spent the next hour doing what I'd done hundreds of times before. Sweeping away years of dust. Straightening shelves that no one had touched since Walter's funeral. Folding old horse blankets that no longer covered any horses. The work was slow, partly because of my age and partly because every object seemed to carry a memory I wasn't ready to leave behind. Every hammer reminded me of another fence Walter had repaired. Every worn rope reminded me of calves we had pulled into the world together during long winter nights. Every scratch on the wooden walls seemed to tell a story only the two of us could remember. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily, drumming against the tin roof above my head. Occasionally I paused simply to listen. It was strange. The barn had always been noisy. Wind slipping through tiny cracks. Rain striking the roof. Wood expanding and settling. Birds fluttering in the rafters. Yet that morning, beneath all those familiar sounds, I kept noticing something else. Faint hollow echo. First I ignored it. Old buildings make strange noises. After nearly 70 years, every board had its own voice. Oh! Each time I walked across the center of the barn, the sound returned. A dull, empty thump beneath my boots. Different from the solid creaking everywhere else. I stopped walking, then took 2 slow steps backward. The sound disappeared. I stepped forward again. There it was. Hollow. Almost as though there were empty space beneath the floor. I frowned. Walter had rebuilt sections of this barn several times over the decades. Perhaps one of the support beams had finally begun to rot. That worried me. If the floor was becoming unsafe, someone could eventually get hurt. I fetched the old flashlight from his workbench and knelt beside the suspicious area. The boards looked perfectly ordinary. Scratched. Covered with decades of dirt. Nothing unusual. I pressed the tip of the broom handle against one plank. Solid. The next one. Solid. Third. Shifted. Only slightly. Barely enough for someone else to notice. But after spending 53 years married to a carpenter, I had learned how it should behave. And this board wasn't behaving normally. I brushed away layers of dirt with my hand. Tiny cracks appeared around its edges. Not natural cracks. Straight lines. Almost perfectly rectangular. As though that particular section had once been removed. And carefully put back into place. A strange chill ran across my shoulders. Walter had never mentioned repairing this part of the floor. In fact, I couldn't remember him ever allowing anyone to move the heavy workbench that stood only a few feet away. Whenever our sons suggested rearranging the barn, he always refused. I like things exactly where they are. That had always been his answer. Back then I thought he was simply being stubborn. No. For the first time in 15 years. I wondered if he had been protecting something instead. I reached for the edge of the loose plank. Before I could pull it, the old wood beneath my right foot cracked with a deafening snap. And suddenly, the floor gave way beneath me. For one terrifying second, I thought the entire barn was collapsing. The rotten board shattered beneath my weight, and my right leg plunged into darkness up to my hip. I dropped the flashlight as my hands slammed against the rough floorboards, barely stopping myself from falling completely through. Dust exploded into the air, filling my lungs until I began coughing so hard my eyes watered. When everything finally became still again, I remained frozen. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it inside my ears. The rain continued falling outside as though nothing had happened. Slowly, I pulled my leg free from the broken opening. My ankle ached, but nothing seemed broken. At my age, I knew how lucky I had been. Another few inches, another weak board, and I might have fallen deep enough to never climb back out alone. I sat on the floor for several minutes, trying to steady my breathing. "Well," I whispered nervously, forcing a weak smile toward the empty room. "I suppose you were trying to tell me something, Walter." The words escaped before I even thought about them. Talking to him had become a habit over the years. Sometimes I imagined he could still hear me. Sometimes I hoped he couldn't. Eventually, I picked up the flashlight and pointed it toward the hole. "First, I saw only darkness. The beam barely reached below the broken boards. Then my eyes adjusted. There was space beneath the floor. Far more space than there should have been. This wasn't simply a gap between support beams. It looked like a narrow chamber, perhaps 3 or 4 feet high, dry, undisturbed, completely sealed from the outside world. A shiver ran through me. Old barns weren't built like this. Walter himself had helped his father rebuild this place after a storm destroyed part of it decades before I met him. I knew almost every inch of the building, or at least, I thought I did. Carefully, I brushed away more splintered wood around the opening. As the dust settled, another detail caught my attention. The support beams surrounding the hole looked much newer than the rest of the barn. Not brand new, but certainly newer. The wood had aged differently. Different grain, different nails, different craftsmanship. Walter had replaced this section at some point, and he had never told anyone. Why? I reached inside with a flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly from one side to the other. Cobwebs covered the corners. A few old field mice scattered deeper into the shadows. Beyond that, nothing. No boxes, no barrels. No obvious reason for such a hidden space to exist. I should have covered the hole, called someone to repair the floor, gone back inside the house. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Is it? I found myself staring into the darkness with a question that refused to leave my mind. If Walter had gone to the trouble of building a hidden chamber beneath the barn, what had he believed was important enough to hide there? Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I walked back to the workbench. I grabbed the old extension ladder leaning against the wall, carried it across the barn, and lowered it carefully through the broken opening. As the ladder touched the dirt below, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was something far more unsettling. Felt as though I was about to step into a part of my husband's life that he had never intended anyone to see. I stood at the edge of the opening longer than I cared to admit. The flashlight rested in one hand. The old ladder creaked softly beneath the weight of its own age. Every sensible thought told me to stop. I was 78 years old, alone, with no cell phone signal inside the barn. If I slipped climbing down, no one would know where to find me until evening. I almost turned back. Then I remembered Walter's face. Not the face from his final days in the hospital. The younger Walter. Strong shoulders. Weathered hands. The quiet smile that always appeared whenever he had already solved a problem before anyone else even realized there was one. He had trusted me. Enough to ask me never to sell this place. Enough to believe I would keep that promise for 15 years without asking another question. If he had trusted me that much, I owed him one last act of trust. I took a slow breath and placed one foot onto the ladder. The first rung groaned. The second held firm. The air became cooler with every step downward. It smelled different beneath the barn. Not damp like an ordinary crawlspace. It smelled dry. Almost preserved. As if fresh air had never reached it. When both feet finally touched the ground, I swept the flashlight across the small chamber. It was larger than I expected. Nearly the size of a small bedroom. The ceiling above me was supported by thick wooden beams that looked stronger than anything else in the barn. Walter hadn't simply dug a hole. He had built this place. Carefully. Deliberately. Every support beam had been measured. Every plank fit perfectly. No farmer would spend weeks constructing something like this without a reason. The dirt floor was surprisingly level. There were no footprints. No animal nests. No signs that anyone had entered in many years. Only silence. The kind of silence that feels almost alive. I slowly walked along the walls, letting the flashlight reveal every inch. Nothing. No shelves. No trunks. No furniture. Just old timber and packed earth. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Perhaps Walter had created the space decades ago for repairs. Perhaps there had never been any secret at all. I laughed quietly at myself. Imagine climbing down here just to find an empty room. My own voice echoed strangely. The echo answered. Not from the walls. From the far corner. I stopped moving. There it was again. Hollow sound. Different from the packed earth beneath my feet. I walked toward the corner, tapping the ground gently with the wooden handle of the flashlight. Solid. 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 Bunk. I tapped again. Bunk. The sound was unmistakable. Something wasn't buried beneath the dirt. Something flat was underneath it. My pulse quickened. I knelt carefully and brushed away a thin layer of dry soil with my hands. The dirt came away much more easily than expected. Within seconds, my fingertips touched wood. Old wood. Smooth. Perfectly flat. Not part of the foundation. Lid. Someone had covered it with dirt on purpose. Someone who wanted it to disappear. Someone who expected no one to ever look beneath the barn floor. Only one person could have done that. Walter. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the outline slowly emerging beneath the dirt. I suddenly understood why he had never wanted the barn sold. Whatever he had hidden, it wasn't inside the barn, had been waiting beneath it. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My hands rested on my knees as I stared at the rectangular outline emerging from the dirt. Years of dust clung to the edges, but there was no doubt about what I was looking at now. A wooden lid. Carefully built. Carefully hidden. Walter hadn't buried something by accident. He had made sure no one would ever find it. They came through the barn floor exactly the way I had. The thought sent another chill through me. Had he known this day would come? Or had fate simply chosen the only way I could ever discover his secret? I brushed away more soil with trembling fingers. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. I smiled despite myself. Walter. Even after all these years, I recognized the way he worked. Every corner perfectly square. Every joint fitted with impossible precision. He used to say that no one would ever see most of his work. But I'll know if it's crooked. That was the kind of man he was. He built things the right way, even when no one else would ever notice. As more of the lid appeared, I noticed something unusual. There were no hinges. No visible lock. No metal handle. Nothing that suggested it was meant to be opened. I ran my fingers slowly along the edge. Smooth. Tiny notch. Barely large enough for a fingertip. Hidden so perfectly beneath the layer of dirt that I almost missed it. I slipped my fingers inside and pulled gently. Nothing. The lid didn't move. I tried again with both hands. Still nothing. It can't be that heavy, I muttered. I climbed back into the barn and searched Walter's old workbench. Most of his tools were exactly where he'd always kept them. Screwdrivers. Pry bar. Several worn hammers. Boxes filled with nails sorted by size. Everything smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil, exactly as it had when he was alive. I picked up the small pry bar he had owned for as long as I could remember. The wooden handle was polished smooth from decades of use. His fingerprints had probably worn it that way. Without thinking, I smiled. You always did leave me the right tool. Back beneath the barn, I carefully slid the flat end of the pry bar into the narrow notch. I applied gentle pressure. The wood groaned. Old dust drifted into the air. But the lid still refused to move. I pressed a little harder. Another groan. This time, something shifted. Only a fraction of an inch. Enough for a thin stream of stale air to escape from below. The smell surprised me. It wasn't mold. It wasn't decay. It smelled dry. Almost clean. Like paper that had been stored safely for decades. Froze. Paper. Walter hadn't hidden machinery. Or money. Or weapons. Whatever lay beneath this lid. It had been protected from moisture all these years. Protected intentionally. My heartbeat quickened. Slowly. Very slowly. I lifted the lid another inch. Before I could see what was inside, the flashlight beam caught something carved into the underside of the wooden cover. 4 simple words. Written in Walter's own unmistakable handwriting. If you're here, it's time. For several seconds I forgot to breathe. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared at the words carved into the underside of the lid. If you're here, it's time. There was no mistaking the handwriting. Walter had taught all 3 of our children to write using the same careful block letters he carved onto every project he built. Even after 15 years, I could recognize the shape of every letter as easily as I recognized his face. My eyes filled with tears. It felt as though he had been standing beside me all along, waiting for this exact moment. I lowered the lid again for a second, pressing my hand against the smooth wood. "What did you know, Walter?" I whispered into the silence. "What were you waiting for?" Of course there was no answer. Only the soft patter of rain above us and the distant creaking of the old barn. I wiped my eyes and gathered my courage. If he had left me a message, then he had expected me to keep going. Slowly I lifted the lid completely. It was heavier than I expected, but carefully balanced, as though Walter had designed it to stay open once raised. The flashlight beam disappeared into a second compartment. Unlike the rough chamber surrounding me, this space had been lined with thick cedar boards. The smell became immediately stronger. Dry cedar, old paper, leather. Everything had been preserved with incredible care. There were no piles of gold, no stacks of cash, no jewels. There were 6 carefully arranged wooden boxes, each one almost identical. Each one handmade. Each one labeled in Walter's handwriting. The first read, "For Evelyn." The second, "For Daniel, our oldest son." The third, "For Sarah, our daughter." The fourth, "For Michael, our youngest." The fifth surprised me. It simply read, "For the grandchildren." Then my flashlight stopped on the 6th. Unlike the others, had no name, only 3 words. "Do not open." A cold wave passed through my entire body. I frowned. Walter had spent months, perhaps years, creating this hidden room. He had prepared individual boxes for every member of our family. Yet, one box had no owner, only a warning. For the first time since climbing beneath the barn, genuine fear settled inside me. Not because I believed anything supernatural was hidden there. Walter wasn't that kind of man. He believed in hard work, common sense, and keeping his promises. If he wrote, "Do not open," he had a reason. I looked back toward my own box, then toward the nameless one. Curiosity tugged at me with surprising force. One part of me wanted answers immediately. Another part remembered 53 years of marriage. Walter never gave instructions carelessly. Whenever he warned someone, it was because he had already imagined every possible consequence. I reached into the compartment. For one brief moment, my hand hovered uncertainly between the 2 boxes. One held the answers he had chosen for me. Other contained something he had desperately hoped no one would ever see. I closed my eyes for a moment and let my hand fall naturally. It landed on the box with my name. "For Evelyn." I smiled through my tears. "Good," I whispered to myself. "Let's do this your way, Walter." If there was one lesson my husband had taught me over 53 years of marriage, it was that patience usually revealed more than curiosity ever could. There had been countless times when I wanted immediate answers. When crops failed. When money was scarce. When one of the children came home crying. Walter never rushed. He would quietly gather every piece of the puzzle before making a decision. That habit had saved our family more times than I could count. Perhaps even now it was still protecting me. The wooden box was surprisingly light. I lifted it carefully from the compartment and placed it on the packed dirt floor beside me. It was beautiful, simple, made from walnut wood polished until it almost glowed beneath the flashlight. No nails were visible anywhere, only perfectly fitted joints. The lid was secured with a small brass latch that had barely tarnished despite the passing years. Walter had built this with love. Not in a hurry. Not because he had to. 'Cause he wanted to. I slowly released the latch. The tiny click echoed throughout the hidden chamber. For reasons I couldn't explain, it felt almost disrespectful to open it too quickly. So I paused, ran my fingers across the smooth lid one last time, then lifted it. Inside lay 3 objects: a leather-bound journal, a bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, and a small velvet pouch. Nothing more. No valuables, no jewelry, no fortune. Just 3 ordinary-looking items. Somehow, they felt heavier than anything I had ever held. I picked up the journal first. The leather had become soft with age. When I opened the cover, a folded photograph slipped onto the dirt floor. I reached down and picked it up. It was our wedding day. Not the photograph everyone kept in family albums. I had never seen this one before. Walter stood smiling beside me in front of the old church. I looked impossibly young, nervous, excited, completely unaware of what life would bring. Then I noticed something strange. In the background, far behind us, standing near the church fence, was another man. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking directly at Walter. I frowned. His face was partly hidden beneath the brim of a hat. I couldn't recognize him. Yet something about the picture felt intentional. Walter had placed it inside this box for a reason. I carefully turned the photograph over. My breath caught immediately. Written on the back in Walter's handwriting were just 2 lines. "You never noticed him." Neither did I. Until it was almost too late. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Almost too late. Too late for what? Slowly, I opened the first page of the journal. Instead of beginning with a date, Walter had written only 1 sentence. Large enough that he knew I would see it before reading anything else. "Everything you believed about the happiest day of our lives was incomplete." I must have read that sentence a dozen times before turning the page. Everything you believed about the happiest day of our lives was incomplete. Walter wasn't the kind of man who exaggerated. He never spoke dramatically. If he chose those words, every one of them mattered. I settled onto the packed earth, leaning against one of the heavy support beams. Above me, the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the roof, muffled now by layers of timber and soil. It felt strangely comforting, as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving only Walter and me in that hidden room one final time. The first page began without greeting. "No, dear Evelyn." No explanation. Only his handwriting. Steady. Exactly as I remembered. "If you're reading this, then I've been gone long enough for you to forgive me. Not because I betrayed you, but because I kept something from you that I believed was necessary. If I had told you while I was alive, you would have insisted on carrying the burden with me. And I loved you too much to let that happen." I stopped reading. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Walter had always protected people before protecting himself. Even when it exhausted him. Even when no one noticed. Especially then. I remembered the countless nights he came home later than expected. The mornings he quietly left before sunrise without explaining where he was going. Whenever I asked, he always had an ordinary answer. Helping a neighbor. Repairing someone's fence. Delivering supplies. Checking on an old friend. None of it had ever sounded suspicious. That was simply who Walter was. Everyone in our county trusted him. Children waved when he drove past. Neighbors borrowed tools knowing he'd never ask for them back. Even the sheriff once joked that Walter knew more about the community than the town records did. I smiled sadly. Then the smile disappeared as I continued reading. Everything began 6 months before our wedding. That photograph inside this box wasn't placed there because of our ceremony. It was placed there because it was the first and only picture ever taken of the man who spent 40 years trying to find something I refused to give him. The flashlight nearly slipped from my hand. 40 years. The same man. I reached for the wedding photograph again, studying the figure standing near the church fence. This time I noticed details I had completely missed before. He wasn't dressed like the other guests. His clothes were darker, more formal. His posture wasn't relaxed. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't even watching the bride. He was watching Walter. Only Walter. The realization sent a shiver through me. How had I never noticed him? How had none of us? I looked back at the journal. Walter's next lines answered the very question forming inside my mind. You didn't notice him because I made certain you wouldn't. I spent our entire wedding day pretending everything was normal. I smiled in every photograph. Danced. I laughed. But every few minutes, I looked toward the church gate to make sure he was still there. And not coming closer. Covered my mouth. My wedding day. The happiest day of my life. Walter had spent it watching a stranger. Protecting me from something I never even knew existed. Somehow, after all these years, I was beginning to understand why he had hidden this journal beneath the barn instead of leaving it inside the house. Because whatever story it contained, it had never truly ended. I closed the journal and rested it on my lap. Not because I wanted to stop reading. 'Cause I needed to breathe. For 53 years, I had believed I knew every important chapter of Walter's life. We had shared one home, one bank account, 3 children, countless worries, countless victories. I knew the scar on his shoulder came from falling out of an apple tree when he was 12. I knew he hated cinnamon in his coffee. I knew he secretly cried the day our oldest son left for college, even though he pretended he had something in his eye. I thought there were no mysteries left between us. Now, sitting beneath the old barn, I realized that the man I loved had carried a burden so heavy that he had hidden an entire room just to leave me the truth. I opened the journal again. Walter's handwriting continued without interruption. Before you let your imagination run away, Evelyn, I need you to know something. I never had another family. I never stopped loving you. Asterisk everything I did. I did because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Asterisk. Without realizing it, I let out a long breath. I hadn't even noticed that part of me had feared exactly that. How strange. One sentence was enough for Walter to calm me, even after death. I smiled sadly. You still know me better than anyone, I whispered. The next pages became more personal. Walter described the months before our wedding. He had been helping his father repair an abandoned farmhouse several miles outside town. The owner had died years earlier, leaving no close relatives behind. The property had fallen into disrepair. Most people avoided it. Walter accepted the job because the pay was good and we were saving every penny to begin our married life. Then one afternoon, everything changed. While replacing part of the kitchen floor, I found a small metal box hidden beneath the foundation. It wasn't buried deeply. Someone had wanted it found. But only by the right person. I frowned. Another hidden compartment. Another secret beneath the floor. Walter had hidden his own truth exactly where he had once discovered someone else's. He continued. Inside the box were several documents, a handful of old photographs, and one leather notebook. At first, I thought it belonged to the previous owner. Asterisk by sunset. I realized it belonged to someone else entirely. Asterisk. I turned the page more quickly now. The mystery had wrapped itself around me completely. Walter explained that the notebook contained names, property descriptions, bank account numbers. None of them belonged to the farmhouse owner. Every page pointed toward the same unidentified man. The man appeared to own nothing officially. Somehow, his name surfaced behind farms, businesses, land purchases, and people who had quietly disappeared from the county decades earlier. Walter admitted he had almost burned everything. He wanted no part of someone else's secrets. But before he could make that decision, he noticed one photograph. It showed the mysterious man standing beside another young man. Walter froze when he recognized him, because the second man was his own father. My heartbeat quickened. I looked up from the page in disbelief. Walter's father had died before I ever met him. He had always been described as an honest farmer, quiet, respected, a man everyone trusted. Walter had adored him. If his father appeared in those photographs, nothing about this story was going where I expected. Then I read the final sentence on the page. It was underlined twice. The day I recognized my father's face was the day I understood that some family histories survive because everyone agrees to stop asking questions. I leaned back against the wooden beam and closed my eyes. Walter's father. Couldn't be. During the 53 years we were married, I had heard countless stories about Henry Collins. Walter always described him as the most honorable man he had ever known. A farmer who believed a handshake mattered more than a contract. A man who paid every debt, helped every neighbor, and expected nothing in return. Our children had grown up hearing those stories. Our grandchildren had too. If Henry appeared beside that mysterious stranger, there had to be another explanation. Walter seemed to know exactly what I would be thinking. The very next paragraph began with words that felt as though he were speaking directly to me. You're probably frightened now. So was I. I wanted to believe the photograph meant nothing. I spent weeks convincing myself there had to be some innocent explanation. Eventually found one. And then I lost it again. I swallowed hard. Walter never wrote dramatically. If he admitted that hope had disappeared, whatever he discovered afterward must have shattered it completely. I continued reading. The notebook listed meetings that took place over nearly 20 years. Some involved land purchases. Some involved livestock. Some involved names I recognized from our county. Then I found my father's name. Only once. Only one meeting. One date. One location. Walter explained that he searched every public record he could find. Old newspapers, property deeds, church registries, county archives. He visited people who were old even back then. Most remembered nothing. Some claimed never to have heard the mysterious man's name. Others became visibly uncomfortable the moment Walter mentioned it. One elderly store owner simply looked around to make sure they were alone before saying something Walter never forgot. Son. Some stories stay buried because digging them up only hurts the people who never caused them. Walter admitted those words haunted him for years. Not because they frightened him. Because they sounded like advice. Someone wasn't protecting the guilty. Someone was protecting innocent families. Including ours. I felt my stomach tighten. Walter had spent decades carrying this alone. Not because he feared for himself. Because he feared what the truth might do to everyone else. The journal continued. I finally visited the location written beside my father's name. It wasn't a business. It wasn't a farm. It wasn't even standing anymore. Only the stone foundation remained. Walter described driving nearly 2 hours into the countryside. The building had burned decades earlier. Trees had reclaimed most of the land. Only scattered stones and the remains of a chimney still stood. He walked the property for hours. Found nothing. As he prepared to leave, an old man appeared from the neighboring farm. He asked Walter a simple question. Are you another Collins? Walter answered yes. The old farmer became silent. He stared at Walter for what must have felt like an eternity. Then he quietly said something that changed everything. Your father wasn't one of them. He was the one who stopped them. I lowered the journal into my lap. The relief hit me so suddenly that I almost laughed. Henry wasn't involved. He had been trying to stop whatever this was. Tears filled my eyes again. Of course, I whispered. That sounds exactly like you. For the first time since opening the journal, hope returned. But Walter's writing immediately reminded me that the story wasn't over. Because beneath those reassuring words, he had written one final sentence, underlined carefully. The old man also told me something else before I drove away. If your father trusted you enough to leave this unfinished, then sooner or later, the man from your wedding will come looking for you. I read that final sentence 3 times before I realized my hands were shaking again. The man from your wedding will come looking for you. Walter had written those words more than 15 years ago. Somehow, reading them beneath the old barn made them feel immediate, as though the danger had never truly disappeared. I rubbed my temples and tried to think clearly. If this man had really spent decades searching for something, why had nothing ever happened? Why had Walter lived a full life? Why had we raised our children in peace? Why had our grandchildren played in this very barn every summer without incident? The journal answered my questions before I could even ask them. If you're wondering why nothing happened, it's because I made sure he believed I had already destroyed what he wanted. That lie bought us 40 peaceful years. 40 years I would gladly live again. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Walter hadn't simply carried a secret. He had carried the responsibility of protecting our family every single day. Without telling any of us, he continued. Every few years I would notice him. Never close. Never speaking. Always watching. At the county fair. Inside church. Once at the hardware store. Another time across the street while I was buying your birthday flowers. Closed my eyes. Suddenly dozens of forgotten memories began returning. Small moments I had never questioned. Times Walter insisted we leave somewhere earlier than planned. Times he quietly suggested taking a different road home. The afternoon he abruptly closed the curtains after looking through the front window. When I asked what was wrong, he smiled. Nothing important. I had believed him. No. I realized those moments had never been random. Walter had seen someone. Someone he never wanted me to notice. The journal continued. You probably remember thinking I became more cautious as I grew older. That wasn't age. It was experience. I laughed softly through my tears. Oh, Walter. How many arguments had we had over those little habits? I used to tease him for checking every door twice before bed. For walking around the property one last time each evening. For insisting that every important document be stored in exactly the same place. I thought he was simply becoming an old farmer with routines. Now every habit suddenly had another meaning. He wasn't afraid of growing old. He was making sure no one could surprise us. I turned another page. Walter described the last time he saw the mysterious man. It happened almost 17 years before Walter died. At the county harvest festival. Thousands of people attended every autumn. Children laughed. Music played. Families filled the streets. Walter had been carrying our youngest granddaughter on his shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Halfway through the parade, he saw him, standing beneath a large maple tree. Older now. Gray hair. A walking cane. But unmistakably the same man from our wedding photographs. Walter watched him. The man watched Walter. Neither moved. Neither smiled. Neither approached. The stranger slowly tipped his hat, turned around, and disappeared into the crowd. Walter underlined his next sentence. That was the day I knew he had finally accepted my lie. He no longer believed I possessed what he wanted. He believed it had vanished forever. I felt relief wash over me. Perhaps the danger truly had ended. Perhaps this entire hidden room existed only because Walter wanted me to understand the burden he had carried. Then my eyes reached the final paragraph on the page. And the relief disappeared. If you're reading this today, then something happened that I never expected. Someone found the barn. Or someone finally stopped looking for me. And started looking for you instead. For a long time I simply sat there in silence. The journal rested open on my lap, but I wasn't reading anymore. I was remembering. Little moments, tiny details, things that had seemed completely ordinary while Walter was alive. Now every memory felt different. Every memory carried a question. I remembered one autumn evening nearly 25 years earlier. Someone had knocked on our front door just after sunset. Walter answered it before I could. They spoke outside for less than 2 minutes. When he came back inside, He smiled as though nothing had happened. "It's just someone asking for directions," he had said. But afterward, he locked every window in the house. I had teased him about it for weeks. Now I wondered, had that visitor really been lost? Or had Walter simply protected me from another truth? I turned another page. The handwriting had become slightly less steady. Walter must have written this part during the final years of his illness. Oh, every sentence remained careful, measured, never wasting a word. "There is something I need you to understand before you continue. The man I watched all those years was never my greatest concern. He was only looking for something. The people behind him were willing to destroy anyone who found it first." A cold sensation settled in my stomach. People. Plural. Walter hadn't been hiding from one determined man. He had been protecting us from an entire network. Kept reading. "Most of them are probably gone by now. Time defeats everyone. But secrets often outlive the people who create them." Those words stayed with me. Walter wasn't afraid of individuals anymore. He was afraid of unfinished business. The journal explained that after meeting the old farmer at the Byrne Foundation, he made one decision that changed the rest of his life. He stopped investigating. Not because he had given up. Because he had learned enough. Enough to know that discovering the entire truth would place our family in unnecessary danger. He chose something much harder. He chose to guard what he had already found. Nothing more. Nothing less. As I read those words, I realized something that brought fresh tears to my eyes. Walter had sacrificed his own peace of mind, so that the rest of us could live without fear. He had carried that weight alone for over 40 years. Not once had he complained. Not once had he tried to make himself look like a hero. That was exactly who he had always been. Quiet strength. Quiet love. Quiet sacrifice. Then I noticed a folded sheet tucked carefully between the journal pages. It wasn't part of the notebook. It had been inserted later. I unfolded it slowly. Unlike everything else, this wasn't written by hand. It was a typewritten page. Yellowed. The paper had become fragile with age. There was no signature, no date, only a single paragraph. "If this document is ever found, destroy it immediately. Anyone possessing the original records automatically becomes responsible for everything connected to them. Do not contact the authorities. Do not involve your family. Trust no one who claims to already know the truth." ****. My heartbeat quickened again. That wasn't Walter's writing. Someone else had given him that warning. Someone who clearly understood what those hidden records represented. At the bottom of the page, Walter had added only one handwritten sentence. Small enough that I almost missed it. I ignored this advice once. It nearly cost someone their life. I stared at Walter's handwritten sentence until the words began to blur. I ignored this advice once. It nearly cost someone their life. That one sentence frightened me more than anything else I had read. Walter wasn't a reckless man. He wasn't curious for the sake of curiosity. If he admitted that one mistake had almost ended in tragedy, then whatever happened next must have convinced him never to take another unnecessary risk. I carefully unfolded the remaining pages tucked behind the typewritten warning. There were only 3. Unlike the journal, these pages weren't written in chronological order. Each one described a single event. The first page carried only a title. The only mistake I ever made. I took a slow breath and began reading. About 3 years after our wedding, I convinced myself that enough time had passed. I believed the man had stopped searching. I believed the notebook could finally help someone. So I made a decision I have regretted every day since. Walter explained that he had traveled nearly 80 miles to meet a retired judge whose honesty was respected throughout the state. He never carried the original notebook. Only copies of a few harmless pages. He wanted advice. Nothing more. The judge listened quietly. Read every document. Just very few questions. Finally, he closed the folder. Looked Walter directly in the eyes. and spoke words Walter never forgot. Young man. Burn these copies. Forget everything you learned. Some truths become more dangerous after they are proven. Walter admitted he almost laughed. He thought the judge was being overly cautious. After all, he possessed only copies. The originals remained safely hidden. Surely no one could know. Or so he believed. The journal continued. 3 nights later, someone broke into the judge's home. My chest tightened. Walter never described violence in detail. He never needed to. His restraint somehow made everything more powerful. He simply wrote. The house was completely destroyed. Every cabinet opened. Every drawer emptied. Every paper scattered. Nothing valuable was stolen. Only documents disappeared. Walter later visited the property. Officially, the break-in was blamed on ordinary thieves. But Walter knew better. No jewelry had been taken. No money. Only files. Only records. Only information. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. The judge survived. Barely. Before I left the hospital, he grabbed my wrist. He knew it was me before I spoke. Walter described the old man's face. Ill. Weak. Barely able to whisper. Yet his message remained perfectly clear. They weren't looking for me. They were following you. I lowered the pages into my lap. A deep sadness settled over me. Walter had carried that guilt alone for decades. Not because the attack had been his fault, but because he believed his search had placed an innocent man in danger. I understood him. That was exactly how Walter's heart worked. If someone suffered anywhere near him, he somehow found a way to blame himself. Then I reached the final paragraph on the page. It explained why he had built the hidden room beneath the barn. Not to protect the documents. Not even to protect himself. He built it after leaving the hospital. Because from that day forward, he swore that no innocent person would ever again be endangered. Simply because they had crossed his path. I remained seated on the packed earth for what felt like an hour. The hidden chamber no longer felt mysterious. Felt sacred. Every board around me had been placed there by Walter's own hands. Every beam had supported not only the old barn above us, but the enormous weight he had carried alone for more than 4 decades. I looked toward the remaining boxes inside the cedar compartment. Daniel, Sarah, Michael, the grandchildren, and finally, the unnamed box. Do not open. Until now, I hadn't questioned why Walter had separated everything so carefully. Now I understood. The journal was never meant to answer every question. It was meant to prepare me. Prepare me to make the same kind of careful decisions he had made his entire life. I reached for the bundle of letters tied with the faded blue ribbon. Unlike the journal, each envelope had a date. Not one had ever been mailed. Walter had written them only for me. The first letter was dated nearly 28 years earlier. I unfolded it gently. My dearest Evelyn, today I almost told you everything. You were standing beside the kitchen sink making apple pie, and I nearly placed the notebook on the table between us. I wanted so badly to stop carrying this alone. Then you smiled at me. And I realized I would rather spend the rest of my life protecting your peace than sharing my burden. The tears came immediately. That sounded exactly like Walter. He had always believed love meant carrying the heavier load whenever possible. Not because anyone asked him to. Because that was simply who he was. I opened the second letter. It had been written almost 10 years later. You asked me today why I still walk around the property every evening before bed. I laughed and blamed old habits. The truth is simpler. Every night I look across the fields to make sure tomorrow will be as peaceful for you as today was. If that sounds foolish, then I hope you never discover why I do it. I pressed the letter against my chest. How many evenings had I watched him disappear outside with a flashlight? Hundreds. Perhaps thousands. Sometimes I teased him. Sometimes I complained about the cold. Sometimes I simply rolled my eyes. Never once had I imagined those quiet walks were acts of love. Not routine. Protection. The third letter was shorter. Far shorter. Its date caught my attention immediately. It had been written only 3 weeks before Walter died. His handwriting trembled noticeably. Some letters wandered slightly across the page. Yet every word remained unmistakably his. If my illness reaches the point where I cannot explain everything myself, promise me one last thing. Do not mistake secrecy for dishonesty. I kept silent because silence was the safest place I could give our family. Please remember me as the husband who loved you, not as the man who kept secrets. I covered my face with both hands. The quiet sob that escaped me echoed softly beneath the barn. For 15 years, I had occasionally wondered why Walter hadn't trusted me enough to tell me everything. Now I finally understood. It had never been about trust. It had been about love. The greatest act of love he believed he could offer was allowing me to live an ordinary, peaceful life. As I carefully folded the final letter, something small slipped from inside the envelope. It landed beside my knee with a faint metallic sound. Picked it up. It was an old brass key. Unlike any key I had ever seen before. Tiny, heavy, beautifully crafted. A small paper tag was tied to it with faded string. On the tag, Walter had written only 4 words. Not for the barn. I turned the little brass key over in the palm of my hand. It couldn't have been more than 2 inches long. Its edges were worn smooth from years of handling, but not from frequent use. This wasn't the kind of key someone carried every day. It had been carefully preserved, just like everything else Walter had left behind. I held it beneath the flashlight. There was no number, no manufacturer, only a tiny engraving near the bow of the key. A single oak leaf. I frowned. That symbol meant something. I was certain I had seen it before. Then it came back to me. Walter's old woodworking bench. When he built furniture for the house, he always stamped the underside with a small oak leaf that he carved himself. It wasn't a signature for customers. It was simply his quiet way of saying, "I made this." This key wasn't bought. Walter had made it. I looked again at the paper tag. Not for the barn. If he felt the need to write that, then he knew my first instinct would be to search for a lock somewhere beneath this hidden room. I did exactly that anyway. For nearly 20 minutes, I examined every wall, every beam, every cedar board, every box. Nothing. No lock matched the key. Walter had been right. It belonged somewhere else. As I stood to return the key to the envelope, my flashlight swept across the remaining boxes. Daniel, Sarah, Michael, the grandchildren. The box with no name. Do not open. It seemed almost to pull my eyes toward it. The warning suddenly felt heavier than before. Walter had trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Would honoring that trust also mean obeying his final instruction? Or had he expected me to ignore it? I almost laughed. Even after his death, Walter still managed to ask impossible questions without saying a single word. My eyes drifted back to the cedar compartment. Something caught my attention. The unnamed box sat slightly farther back than the others. Not by much. Perhaps half an inch. At first I assumed I was imagining it. But when I carefully removed Daniel's box and then Sarah's, I realized I had been right. The mysterious box wasn't resting directly on the cedar floor. It was sitting on a narrow wooden platform, carefully built into the compartment. I crouched lower. The platform had a tiny circular opening, exactly the size of the brass key in my hand. Froze. Walter hadn't written "Do not open." He had written it on the box. But he had hidden the key beside my letters. If he truly wanted no one to ever open it, why leave me the only key capable of reaching it? My heartbeat grew louder. I looked at the key, then at the small lock beneath the platform. Walter was giving me one final choice. Not forcing me, trusting me, just as he always had. I closed my hand around the brass key. But instead of inserting it into the lock, I whispered the question I wished I could ask him one last time. What would you do if you were me? The hidden room answered with silence. Somehow, for the first time that day, I realized I already knew. I turned the brass key over between my fingers one last time. Walter had always believed that the hardest decisions were the ones no one else could make for us. He never told our children what careers to choose. He never forced opinions. He offered advice, then trusted people to decide for themselves. No, even after his death, he was doing the same thing. I looked at the lock beneath the wooden platform, then at the words burned into the lid above it. Do not open. The warning wasn't dramatic. It wasn't underlined. It wasn't followed by an explanation. That made it even more powerful. Walter assumed I would understand. Fully. I placed the brass key back into my pocket. No, I whispered. If you didn't want me opening it first, then I won't. The moment I said those words, an unexpected sense of peace settled over me. Not disappointment, relief. For the first time since entering the hidden chamber, I stopped chasing answers and started listening to what Walter had actually been trying to teach me. This place wasn't built to satisfy curiosity. It was built to protect people, including me. I carefully returned my box to the cedar compartment exactly where I had found it. Then I reached for Daniel's, our oldest son, the responsible one, the practical one, the child who had always tried to become his father. The box opened with the same soft click. Inside rested only a sealed envelope. Nothing else. Across the front, Walter had written, "Only after your mother has read her journal." Smiled. Even now, Walter was organizing our family one careful step at a time. I resisted the temptation to peek inside. Instead, I placed it back exactly as it had been. Sarah's box contained something different. A faded photograph of her sitting on Walter's shoulders during the county fair. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Beneath it lay another envelope. On its front, Walter had written, "You always believed kindness was weakness. I hope this changes your mind." My eyes softened. Sarah had inherited my stubbornness. Walter had always understood her better than anyone. Michael's box was next. Our youngest. The dreamer. The one who spent more time fixing broken radios than finishing homework. His envelope carried only one sentence. Never apologize for seeing possibilities that others cannot. A tear escaped before I realized it. Walter hadn't left money. He hadn't left instructions about property. He had left something infinitely more valuable. He had left each child exactly the words they would need, long after he was gone. Finally, I lifted the box labeled, "For the grandchildren." Inside were dozens of small envelopes. Each one carried a name. Emily, Jacob, Lily, Nathan, Grace, Oliver. Every grandchild. Every birthday carefully remembered. Every message written by hand. I couldn't stop crying. Walter had prepared conversations that would continue years after his death. He knew he wouldn't watch them graduate, or marry, or become parents themselves, so he found another way to stay with them. One letter at a time. I gently closed the final box. Looking around the hidden room once more, I suddenly realized something extraordinary. There had never been treasure beneath the barn. Not the kind people spend their lives searching for. Walter's treasure had always been his family. Everything hidden beneath that floor. Every journal, every letter, every carefully carved box had been built for one purpose. Keep loving us, even after he was gone. I don't know how long I remained in that hidden room. Time seemed to move differently beneath the barn. Perhaps because, for the first time since Walter's funeral, I didn't feel as though he was gone. I felt as though I was finally having the conversation we never had the chance to finish. One question, however, refused to leave my mind. If the letters were the true inheritance, then why build such an elaborate place to hide them? Walter could have rented a safe deposit box. He could have hidden everything in the attic. He could have left instructions with his attorney. He spent months constructing a secret chamber beneath an old barn. There had to be another reason. I opened the journal again. Several pages near the back remained unread. Walter's handwriting looked weaker now. Not rushed, simply tired. By now, you've probably realized that the letters were never the reason I built this room. Neither were the boxes. Those could have been hidden almost anywhere. I nodded unconsciously. Exactly, I whispered. Walter continued. The room exists because every family deserves one place where truth can survive untouched by anger, pride, or fear. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Suddenly I understood. Walter hadn't built a hiding place. He had built a sanctuary. A place where our family's story could remain exactly as it happened. Not changed. Not exaggerated. Not forgotten. Kept reading. One day our children will disagree. Their children will disagree. Someone will remember events differently. Someone will believe old rumors. Someone may even doubt the kind of man I was. If that day ever comes, bring them here. Let this room speak instead of you. My throat tightened. Walter wasn't trying to defend his reputation. He was protecting our family from something far more dangerous than secrets. Misunderstanding. How many families had been torn apart because no one could ask the people who were gone? Walter had thought about that years before his death. Even now, he was still trying to keep us together. The next page contained something unexpected. A neatly folded map. Not of the county. Not of the state. Of our own farm. Walter had drawn every fence. Every tree. Every gate. Every building. In remarkable detail. First it looked ordinary. Then I noticed one tiny mark. Small oak leaf. The same symbol carved into the brass key. It wasn't beneath the barn. It wasn't near the house. It was drawn beside the oldest oak tree on the entire property. The one standing alone on the western hill. My breath caught. Tree. Walter loved that tree. Every anniversary we ate lunch beneath its branches. Our grandchildren built swings there. When lightning struck it years ago, neighbors suggested cutting it down. Walter refused. It's still alive, he said. It deserves the chance to keep growing. I had always thought he was talking about the tree. No, I wasn't so sure. At the bottom of the map, Walter had written one final note. If you ever decide to use the brass key, do not return here. Walk to the old oak. You'll understand why I marked it. I slowly folded the map. The brass key suddenly felt much heavier inside my pocket. It had never belonged beneath the barn. Walter had told me that from the beginning. Whatever lock it opened had been waiting beneath the old oak tree all along. For a long time I simply stared at the map. The old oak tree. How many times had I walked past it without giving it a second thought? Hundreds, perhaps thousands, had always been there. Older than our marriage. Older than the barn. Even older than the farmhouse itself. Walter used to say that some trees watched generations come and go without ever moving an inch. Now I wondered if that tree had been watching over something else all those years. I folded the map carefully and slipped it inside the journal. The brass key rested heavily in my sweater pocket. Every instinct urged me to walk straight to the western hill. But another voice inside me, the voice Walter himself had quietly shaped over 5 decades, reminded me that haste had never solved anything. I climbed the ladder slowly, carrying my box, the journal, and the bundle of letters. When I emerged into the barn, the afternoon light had changed completely. The rain had stopped. Golden sunlight streamed through the cracks in the old walls, filling the dusty air with narrow beams of light. For the first time since Walter died, the barn no longer felt empty, felt peaceful. I looked around one last time before lowering the hidden lid back into place. Every movement felt strangely ceremonial. I brushed the remaining dirt across the wooden cover exactly as I had found it, replaced the loose boards, moved Walter's old workbench back over them. No one walking into that barn would ever imagine what rested beneath their feet. Smiled. Your secret is safe, I whispered. Then I stopped. No. Our secret. Outside, the air smelled fresh after the rain. The fields shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Far in the distance, I could already see the outline of the old oak tree standing alone against the sky. It seemed almost larger than I remembered. Its massive branches stretched in every direction like open arms. Walter loved that tree more than any other place on the farm. Every anniversary, he insisted we eat lunch beneath it, even when the weather was less than perfect. One year, after a heavy storm had split one of its largest branches, I suggested planting a younger tree nearby. Walter smiled and shook his head. Some things don't become valuable because they're perfect. They become valuable because they've survived. At the time, I thought he was talking about the tree. Now I realized, he might have been talking about us. I started walking toward the hill. The ground was still soft from the rain. Each step felt strangely familiar. Halfway there, I noticed something that made me stop. Narrow path, almost invisible beneath the grass. It wasn't a proper trail anymore, just a faint line where the earth seemed slightly firmer. I frowned. How many times had I crossed this field without noticing it? I knelt and touched the ground. The path hadn't formed naturally. It had once been used regularly. Years ago. Long enough for nature to reclaim most of it. But not completely. Walter had walked this way. Again and again. Probably without me ever realizing. I looked toward the old oak. The path led directly to it. Every quiet evening when Walter said he was checking the fences. Every slow walk after dinner. Every peaceful sunset I watched from the porch. Perhaps he hadn't been checking the farm at all. He had been coming here. Not because he feared someone would find his secret, but because he wanted to make sure it remained exactly where he believed it belonged. Waiting for the day I was finally ready to understand it. The closer I came to the old oak tree, the slower I walked. Not because the hill was steep. Because every step seemed to uncover another memory. Walter and I had shared more afternoons beneath this tree than I could possibly count. It shaded our picnic blanket during every anniversary. Our children learned to climb its lowest branches. When our first grandson took his first steps, it was beneath this very tree that Walter caught him before he fell. To everyone else, it was simply the oldest tree on the farm. It had quietly witnessed our entire life together. The faint path ended a few feet from the trunk. The grass there grew shorter than anywhere else around the hill. Not freshly cut, simply worn, as though countless careful footsteps had passed over the same ground through the years. Walter's footsteps. I reached the enormous trunk and rested my hand against the rough bark. Its surface felt warm from the afternoon sun. Deep grooves twisted upward toward branches that stretched high into the summer sky. The tree was magnificent, even now, even after decades of storms. I slowly removed the folded map from the journal. Walter had drawn the oak with remarkable accuracy. One thick root curved toward the south. Another disappeared beneath a cluster of moss-covered stones. And beside the western side of the trunk, he had drawn the tiny oak leaf symbol. Exactly where I was now standing. I looked down. First, I saw nothing unusual. Only roots, leaves, small stones. Then I remembered something Walter often did. Every spring, while I planted flowers near the porch, he came here with a rake. Not to clear the entire hill. Only this one small section beside the trunk. I had always assumed he simply liked keeping the place tidy. No. I gently brushed aside the layer of fallen leaves. The earth beneath looked different. Not disturbed. Deliberately maintained. The moss formed an almost perfect circle. Too perfect. Carefully, I lifted it away with both hands. Beneath the moss was a flat stone. Unlike the natural rocks surrounding it, this one had been cut. Its edges were smooth and surface level, almost square. My pulse quickened. I knelt beside it. Near one corner, hidden beneath decades of dirt, was a tiny brass keyhole. Exactly the size of the key resting inside my pocket. Walter hadn't buried something beneath the tree. He had built something beneath it. For a long moment, I simply stared at the lock. The afternoon breeze stirred the branches overhead. Leaves whispered softly above me. It almost sounded like voices, like memories, like Walter. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the brass key. This was different from the box beneath the barn. There had been a warning there. Do not open. There was no warning, no hesitation, only a map, symbol, and a key. Walter hadn't forbidden this. He had invited me. Oh. Before inserting the key, I looked back across the farm. From the top of the hill I could see everything. The farmhouse, the weathered barn, the fields we had worked together for half a century. It suddenly struck me that Walter had chosen this exact spot for a reason. Here, you could see every place that had mattered in our lives. The tree wasn't hiding from the farm. It was watching over it. I turned back toward the stone, slipped the brass key into the lock, and heard a soft metallic click. Immediately, something beneath the stone released. Not with a loud mechanism, not dramatically, just a quiet sound, almost gentle, as though Walter himself had whispered, "Now you're ready." I waited several seconds before touching the stone. The click had been so soft that I almost questioned whether I had imagined it. Slowly, I pressed both hands against its surface. Moved. Not much. Just enough for a thin line of darkness to appear beneath one edge. Walter had designed the mechanism perfectly. The stone wasn't heavy because of brute force. It was balanced, just as carefully engineered as everything else he had ever built. With one steady push, the slab slid several inches aside. Cool air drifted upward. It carried the familiar scent of cedar, the same scent that had filled the hidden room beneath the barn. Walter had built this place too. I smiled through fresh tears. You really thought of everything. The opening beneath the stone wasn't large, only wide enough for someone to reach inside. There were no stairs, no underground chamber, only a carefully crafted cedar compartment protected from moisture by layers of stone, moss, and earth. Inside rested one object, nothing more. No piles of documents, no mysterious notebooks, no fortune hidden for generations. Only a long wooden case. It looked almost like the kind musicians used to carry violins. Except this one was handmade. Its walnut surface had been polished until it reflected the afternoon sunlight filtering through the oak leaves. Across the lid, Walter had carved another sentence. Not burned, not written, carved by hand. Every letter patient, every line deliberate. The last thing I can ever give you. I carefully lifted the case from its resting place. It was surprisingly light, much lighter than I expected. I sat beneath the old oak exactly where Walter and I had shared so many anniversary lunches. The breeze moved gently through the branches above me. Birds sang somewhere across the pasture. For the first time all day, nothing felt frightening anymore, only peaceful. I opened the brass latch. The lid rose slowly. There was no gold, no jewels, no legal documents. A beautifully folded quilt rested inside the case. I recognized it immediately. My hands flew to my mouth. It was ours. The quilt Evelyn and Walter had begun stitching together during our first winter of marriage. Every square represented a year of our life together. The blue fabric from the dress I wore on our first anniversary. A small patch cut from Daniel's baby blanket. Pieces of Sarah's favorite Sunday dress. One corner made from Michael's old school shirt after he outgrew it. Even tiny pieces from each grandchild's first blanket had been sewn into the later sections. I had searched for this quilt after Walter died. We both believed it had disappeared during a move years earlier. Walter had smiled sadly whenever I mentioned it. I suppose some things simply find their own place. Now I knew. He had hidden it himself. Not because it was valuable. Because it was our story. Folded into cloth. Waiting for the day I would need it most. As I gently lifted the quilt, a single envelope slid from beneath it. Unlike every other letter, this one carried no date. Only 2 words written across the front. Open last. My hands trembled as I picked up the final envelope. It was lighter than I expected. There was only a single sheet of paper inside. No photographs, no maps, no hidden keys. Just one last letter. For several moments, I simply looked at Walter's handwriting across the front. Open last. He knew me well enough to understand that I would follow his instructions. I always had, even when I complained first. I smiled through my tears. All right, I whispered. One last conversation. I carefully unfolded the letter. Unlike the journal, the handwriting was larger, simpler, almost as though Walter wanted every word to be easy for my aging eyes to read. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you found every place I hoped you would find. Not because I wanted you to uncover my secrets, because I wanted you to discover the truth they were protecting. Pause. The afternoon breeze lifted one corner of the paper. I held it gently against my knee. Walter continued. People spend their lives believing treasure is made of gold. They are wrong. Gold is inherited. Love is built. My eyes filled again. How perfectly that sounded like him. Walter had never measured wealth by money. When neighbors bought larger tractors, he smiled and kept repairing ours. When others expanded their farms, he planted another apple tree instead. He used to tell the children, wealth isn't what you own. It's what remains when everything you own disappears. At the time, I thought it was simply another one of his quiet sayings. No, finally understood. He continued. If you expected money beneath the barn, I'm sorry to disappoint you. If you expected answers to every mystery, I'm sorry for that too. Some questions deserve to remain unfinished. Not because truth is dangerous, but because peace is sometimes more valuable than certainty. Closed my eyes. All day I had searched for one final explanation. One dramatic revelation. One hidden fortune. Is it? Walter had been guiding me toward something much greater. Acceptance. He wasn't asking me to solve his past. He was asking me to protect our family's future. The final paragraphs were the most personal words he had ever written to me. Promise me one more thing. Let our children inherit kindness before they inherit property. Let our grandchildren remember laughter before they remember loss. If they ever ask who I truly was, do not show them the hidden room first. Show them the quilt. Tell them the stories. Teach them why every patch exists. If they still want answers after that, then bring them beneath the barn. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. Quilt, not the journal, not the hidden chamber. The quilt was the true inheritance. Because every piece of fabric represented someone who had been loved, someone who belonged. Walter wasn't preserving evidence. He was preserving a family. The final lines were almost impossible to read through my tears. You once asked me what the greatest day of my life was. I answered, the day we married. That wasn't completely true. The greatest day of my life was every ordinary day I woke up beside you afterward. Thank you for giving me a life worth protecting. I'll love you beyond every season this old oak tree ever sees. Forever, Walter. I waited 3 weeks before telling anyone. Not because I wanted to keep Walter's secret. Because I wanted to understand it first. Every evening, I returned to the old oak tree with the quilt folded across my lap. Sometimes I read another page of the journal. Sometimes I simply sat in silence beneath the branches. The strange thing was, the more time I spent there, the less interested I became in unanswered questions. The mysterious man, the hidden notebook, the forgotten names, they no longer felt important. Walter had been right. Peace had quietly replaced curiosity. One Saturday afternoon I called our children. Daniel drove in first with his wife. Sarah arrived an hour later, carrying her famous peach pie. Michael came last, apologizing as always for being late. Soon afterward, the grandchildren filled the yard with laughter. Exactly as they had when they were little. Watching them from the porch, I suddenly understood why Walter had fought so hard to protect ordinary days. Because ordinary days become extraordinary memories before we even realize they're happening. After dinner, I asked everyone to follow me. No one questioned it. We walked slowly across the pasture, past the weathered barn, the familiar hill, until we reached the old oak tree. Daniel smiled. I haven't been here in years. Sarah rested her hand against the trunk. I forgot how big it is. Michael laughed. Dad always insisted this was the best spot on the whole farm. He was right, I answered. Then I opened the wooden case. Carefully, I unfolded the quilt. For a long moment, no one spoke. The grandchildren knelt beside it first. They pointed at the tiny patches of fabric. Whose shirt was this? What dress is this piece from? When was this made? Instead of answering immediately, smiled. Exactly as Walter had asked me to. I told them every story. Daniel's baby blanket, Sarah's Sunday dress, Michael's school uniform, the tiny blue square cut from my wedding dress, the faded denim from Walter's favorite work shirt. Each patch carried a memory. Each memory brought another smile, sometimes another tear. The children weren't looking at cloth anymore. They were looking at their own family history. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills. Golden light filtered through the old oak branches exactly as it had on countless anniversaries before. Only then did Daniel quietly ask the question I knew would eventually come. Dad left more than this, didn't he? I looked toward the barn, then back at my children. Finley. He nodded. Yes. There are letters. There is a journal. And one day, when all of you are ready, I'll show you. No one asked to see them immediately. To my surprise, no one even stood up. Is it? Emily, my oldest granddaughter, gently ran her fingers across one corner of the quilt. I think Grandpa already told us the most important part. Everyone looked at her. She smiled. He wanted us together. Silence followed. The beautiful kind. Not empty. Complete. I looked up into the branches of the old oak. The wind stirred the leaves softly. For just a moment, closed my eyes. And I could almost hear Walter laughing. Not because his secrets had survived. Because his family had. As we folded the quilt together, I realized something that had taken me 15 years to understand. Walter never asked me to save an old barn. He asked me to protect what the barn represented. A place where love had been built patiently, quietly, day after ordinary day. The hidden room was never the treasure. The oak tree was never the treasure. Not even the letters were. The treasure had been sitting around me all along. My children, my grandchildren, the memories we still carried, and the man who loved us enough to spend his entire life protecting them. As we walked back toward the farmhouse together, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The old barn stood peacefully beneath the evening sky, weathered, crooked, beautiful, just like the life Walter and I had built. Some people leave behind money, some leave behind land. My husband left behind something far rarer. He left behind a family that still knew how to sit together, tell stories, forgive old wounds, and love one another. And perhaps, that is the greatest inheritance anyone can ever leave. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and join us again for another journey through the extraordinary stories hidden inside ordinary lives. Until next time, thank you for spending this time with me.